You don't want me to give another 35-minute soliloquy on affairs in Syria?
To be honest with you, I got good feedback for that. People were like, that's remarkable. He didn't even take a breath. This week on Socially Democratic, will Albo be drawn into Dutton's culture wars? Can Labor survive the rise of anti-incumbent right-wing sentiment around the world? And are you ever too old to watch Karate Kid? David Feeney and I do a deep dive into these questions and more. It's all coming up, but first, a word from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. Okay, we are taping this one on a Friday on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining me for our first edition of the Feeney Files in 2025 is the former campaign director for the Victorian Labor Party, former member for Batman, former senator for Victoria. And he's looking all sunny and fresh from his vacation holidays, you name it. David Feeney, welcome back for another year of the Feeney Files. How are you?
I'm very well. Happy New Year to you.
Indeed. December and January is usually a slow month for political media. All the journalists and politicians all take their leave, so there's not much to report on unless the poor burghers of Northern Australia are suffering floods, or those of us in Southern Australia are having to deal with bushfires. But thankfully, not too much of that happened this summer. But it is the beginning of an election year. And time is the most important resource on a campaign. And I just want to get your initial reflections on how the federal Labor government is currently trying to frame up this important election year as we not turn the page, but hang our new calendar on the walls for 2025.
Yeah, well, I think we did see the federal Labor government slide into campaign mode. And I think we've seen the Prime Minister looking sharper and being very active in terms of trying to get in front of the media in, as you say, a period where political news is slow. That's sometimes a good time for an incumbent to sort of maximise that vacuum and get themselves into the frame. And I think Prime Minister Albanese did a bit of that. And I think we've also seen a number of other ministers also stepping up to the plate and trying to push forward their election messages. I've noticed Pat Conroy doing this in the defence space, and most critically, Treasurer Jim Chalmers doing this in the economic space, where he really is trying to paint a message of how the inflation dragon has been conquered. Labor's economic strategy is working. And that kind of lends itself to the message that, so much has been accomplished, but there's more to be done. Don't change horses midstream. And I think Chalmers has been quite effective at that. And the economic portents hopefully mean that that story will culminate in a interest rate cut in the middle of this month. So that would be blessed relief for the government and strongly on message. Conversely, if that doesn't happen, then life remains hard.
I mean, that was some good news that came out on Wednesday with those inflation figures. And so a lot of them, first of all, I think that surprised a number of economists. And it was below what the RBA had predicted. And so now there's a sort of a mood or a feeling that there will be a cut in interest rates on the 15th of February. It's the day after Valentine's Day. When's Valentine's Day?
You and I should both know that. So why you're advertising our ignorance on this show is a mystery to me. But I do know the Reserve Bank's meeting on the 18th of February. So that,
Ah.
that speaks to my tragic life, perhaps.
Luckily, your partner doesn't listen to this podcast. Okay. Anyway, back on track. So, uh, like one thing I thought about, like this is good news, and hopefully we get more. The government gets more good news come the middle of February. But I also thought about during the Biden administration, there was a lot of good news economically, but it didn't translate into the feeling and sentiment amongst voters. How does the government manage to both say this is good news, we're on the right path, but also a set of figures isn't going to necessarily immediately translate to the costs that you're experiencing for your groceries or even on your mortgage, although they are going to see that cut for their mortgage, which will be impactful. But I just want to get it. How do you get that balance right politically?
Yeah, well, I don't think the Biden analogy works because, of course, Biden's chief problem was he couldn't coherently speak to the American people, and adopted a strategy of not doing much in the way of interviews or press conferences, and that's a very particular issue to him and his administration. We have lots of active spokespeople who are out there telling the story. So the challenge is, as you say, how do you make these big numbers and percentages and abstract notions mean anything to people who are continuing to still struggle in their real lives? And the answer to that has to be you have to tell the story and you have to make it that story meaningful for people who are living their lives on the ground. And that has to be a story of how there has been gain with the pain, and hope that better, and tell them hope that better times are on the horizon, and that this government has been an effective economic manager. It has run surplus budgets. It has managed an economic program which has been put downward pressure on interest rates while at the same time doing what it can to alleviate um, uh, uh, household spending pressures. And it's heading into a future now where there can be hope for reasonable wage growth in a low inflationary environment. Um, Telling that story is not easy. But I take my hat off to Jim Chalmers. I think he's persistent and he gets it and he's on it. Yeah, it doesn't quite have the same resonance as the Prime Minister and his press gravitas, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But I think the Treasurer understands that mission and is on it.
We had a cabinet reshuffle announced over the summer break as well, with the departure of a former colleague of yours and Victorian MP Bill Shorten. Want to get your initial reflections on the reshuffle itself, sort of, setting your team up ready for the final push to the line for election day.
Yeah, I thought it was a very workmanlike reshuffle. There were no major or dramatic shifts. The team that Albo put in place at the outset remains largely intact. He's got some retirements, but none of those retirements are a shock. They're all long-serving MPs who have decided that the season of politics is over in their lives, and that's fair and reasonable. The government remains scandal-free. It hasn't lost a minister to scandal or disaster, and that's a credit to it. So that's the kind of normal turnover that indeed you might almost say is healthy. You want a bit of turnover in a cabinet with the natural inflection of time and talent moving through the conveyor belt of the parliamentary ranks. So I thought the reshuffle was noteworthy, if for nothing than it being a sign of a good, stable government that was moving in an orderly way, and it wasn't chaotic or divided or, some of the other things that we've experienced in the last quarter century of Labor history. This was a sign of a healthy organisation.
And congrats to a friend of the pod, Annika Wells, who's rewarded for all of her excellent work in the aged care portfolio. Was promoted to the cabinet, which I thought was a great call. She's obviously a talent, and she is one of those politicians that understands retail politics. It comes very naturally to her. So congrats to you, Annika, on your elevation. That's fantastic news. Bill Shorten's departure brings to a close his 18 years in the parliament. You both entered federal politics at the same time at the 2007 election, and you've known Bill for a very, very, very long time. I just wanted to get some thoughts on from you about Bill's contribution that he made to public life, both as a union official but also as a member for Maribyrnong and the leader of our great party.
Yeah, I think uh, he's got that rare accomplishment amongst politicians of leaving at a moment of his own choice. And I think his departure was well timed. It wasn't. It didn't happen amid destabilisation or any bad blood. He leaves as a cabinet minister in Prime Minister Albanese's government, who kept faith with the mission the Prime Minister gave him, which was to make the NDIS sustainable and to reform it. And he did that, and he did that effectively and to some extent in a bipartisan fashion, which means that institution, the NDIS, really, I think, has a more assured future as a bipartisan structure of federal government. And that's a great accomplishment for him because, of course, he's really the person who I think gets the lion's share of credit for inventing the NDIS, and so it was acutely in his interest to make sure it worked, and it is hopefully on the path to a more sustainable future. It's, I do in my quiet moments angst about how much it costs, but he certainly got that growth trajectory down. So his departure was a good one, and it happened in the aftermath of that critical accomplishment. I think he'll be remembered. He had two stints or two tilts at the prime ministership. Obviously, history tells us he was unsuccessful in both, but what that speaks to is that he was a Labor leader for a considerable period of time, and a considerable period of time in the aftermath of the Rudd-Gillard conflict. So he did manage to bring a period of stability and unity to a caucus that was and had been deeply divided. That too is an accomplishment. He will get derided in some quarters for having an over-ambitious program as opposition leader, and I've always believed that is an unfair criticism, because in the aftermath of the 2013 defeat, Labor, I think, did need to restock its ideological credentials. And Bill was an unlikely ideological leader, but he, I think, wanted the Labor Party to have a policy-led recovery. And so that policy-led recovery of the Labor Party, I think, was worthwhile. It obviously was a strategy that ultimately went awry, but it was a strategy that was adopted and embraced by the Brains Trust of the time, and so it was a collective failure. It's not fair to just say it was Bill Shorten's mistake. And if you look back at it in detail, and I won't drag you through it in detail, but the debate, Labor decided, Bill Shorten and Labor decided that we would take the policy initiative and engage the federal government in a policy debate of our choosing and then win it. And the first topic selected for that campaign to sort of seize the policy initiative from opposition was negative gearing. And if you remember, Labor announced a policy around negative gearing. There was a sharp debate in the media and elsewhere. And, to cut a long story short, Labor won that debate. The government retreated from the argument. The Labor's policy was generally endorsed and embraced across the board. There are obviously some diehard holdouts in real estate and elsewhere, but when the dust settled, it had been a case of mission accomplished. We'd taken the policy initiative, grappled with a thorny issue, had the public policy debate and won it. I guess what followed was then a decision to rinse and repeat, this time with franking dividends. And with hindsight, it's clear that was a bridge too far because, to my ever wonder, that became a public policy debate that we almost inexplicably lost because there was very little understanding of what franking credits were. And so a vast number of Australians were concerned that it would affect them, even though it was in fact a change that affected very few Australians. So there were, and I guess that speaks to my final point, which is in the 2019 federal election, I think where Labor fell short was in its ability to communicate its policy positions and how they would make Australia a better place. So we lost an air war on a policy foundation. Now, of course, history tells us that in the aftermath of that, those policies were set aside, and Albo took a small target strategy forward, which ultimately resulted in victory. But I think it would be a mistake for us to draw the lesson from that there are not moments when it is a good thing for Labor to engage in strong, brave, difficult public policy debates where we set the ground right. I guess learning the lesson that when the election comes around, we've got to be ready to communicate those policies sharply and clearly so that they don't just become the butt of conspiracy theorists and negative campaigners. Anyway, I get that there's a long-winded way of saying that, Bill Shorten's errors at that period were not, I think, as grave as are often made, and they were collective errors. They weren't just his. A consequential leader who did things with his time in Parliament, made a contribution in the Albanese government and has left at a moment of his own choosing. So he's got a lot to be proud of.
He does. Look out, Canberra, in his new job.
There is a joke, of course, that Canberra University now, there's this thing about the 8 universities that kind of dominate public policy making in the university sector, which does not include Canberra University. That the G8 of universities will become a G9 once Bill gets going, and they find Canberra Uni inexplicably chairing meetings. But anyway, we'll see how that joke pans out.
Indeed, I agree. And the Liberals. Let's look at the other side of the chamber as well in terms of reshuffles. The Liberal Senator Simon Birmingham from your former state, South Australia, resigned from Parliament and has given Dutton an opportunity to reshuffle his team ahead of the election. And it's interesting to know Deputy Leader Susan Ley was completely snubbed for the Foreign Affairs spot. Apparently, the deal is within the coalition is that the Deputy Leader gets to choose what portfolio they would like.
That's our tradition as well, of course.
Right. Okay. There you go. That's
right. The Prime Minister allocates all portfolios, but the Deputy gets to choose.
And Susan Ley apparently wanted Foreign Affairs. Didn't get Foreign Affairs.
Oh, well, she might see herself as the next Julie Bishop, but I think no one else sees her that way. I thought the reshuffle was, barely worth a comment. A group of opposition non-entities shuffled around a little bit. I guess what it does show is Dutton put what talent he has in those areas of policy where he intends to take the initiative. So that was interesting. I think Birmingham is a loss for the Liberal Party. He very dry, not a huge public persona, not a huge retail politician, but a very capable senator and someone who was a leadership figure in the moderate wing of the Liberal Party, a wing which, with Dutton as leader, needs a lot of pastoral care, and so they'll feel his loss. And some of the big moderate leaders of my era, like Christopher Pyne or Maurice Payne, are gone. And now, who's going to take over the leadership of that wing of the Liberal Party, I think, is still an open question.
Let's talk about the election date.
Okay.
And I'm wondering about how you want to approach this, because I've got a whole bunch of notes in front of me, which I think I've shared with you. And basically, I just want to have a conversation about working out when do we think the election date will be. If you're the campaign manager and you're trying to work through when you want to hold the election, what goes into your thinking?
Well, you've put this to me before, and I'm going to be boring because my answer hasn't changed. You call an election when you think you can win it, and that will be the only consideration. And if you don't think you can win it, then you hold on to the very final day, because that's what governments do. So what does that mean? It means I still think the election will be in May. Now, there's lots of good reasons why I could be wrong. The government may not want to go to another budget. It may decide that it wants to, uh, hit the polls in March because the timing will be better then. But all of those are possible, but my money is still on May. Now, as I said, the Reserve Bank in the middle of February might mean that Labor's economic story has got a big tick in the late February, and that might change the judgment a bit, but I suspect not. I think you'll need time to bake that economic success story into the media and the electorate. You've got I think a WA election in March, and there might be a view that we need the dust to settle from that before we go to the federal polls. So, yeah, my money's still on May.
So if I can run through some of, just for the folks playing along at home, I've run through some of the kind of key dates that sort of would play into the people's deliberations. And look, broadly, David, I agree with you. Like I've always agreed. I've always shared the same view as you. That is, you go when you are ahead. We'll look at polls a little bit later in the pod. So there's a potential interest rate cut by the RBA in the middle of February. There's a federal budget that's supposed to be handed down on the 25th of March. The Western Australian election is going to be held on Saturday, the 8th of March. There's a view that if the Prime Minister calls an election immediately following the WA election, which though he would have to do that on either Monday, the 10th of March, then the earliest date he could have the election would be Saturday, April 12. So there's a lot of people talking about that being the date because that way he gets hopefully good news from the RBA, has the West Australia election, so he avoids the sort of the noise there, and then on the Monday calls the federal election. That also means that because the following Saturday after April 12 is Saturday the 19th, that's Easter Saturday. The following Saturday after that is the 26th of April, and that is the day after Anzac Day. Evidently, people tell me that politicians are petrified of Christians and veteran holidays. I will point out that Passover is on the 12th to the 20th. Don't know if they're factoring in our sons and daughters of Abraham. And then after that, you're moving into May. So it's May 3rd, 10th, or the 17th. And 17th is technically the last date to have an election. So you're thinking, what, the 3rd, 10th, or 17th? Go as late as you possibly can, whereas other folks are saying if we avoid that Anzac and Easter period, you would have an April 12 election, is kind of the thinking.
Yeah, and that might be right. I mean, the reason my money's on May is because right here, right now, we're looking at a situation where Labor's primary vote is, about 10% behind the primary vote of the opposition. And it's about 30 versus 40. And we've got Albanese's net approval, at least if you believe Newspoll, has sort of taken a big hit, but is now sort of stabilising. It's not continuing to decline. And so I think, and this is all, it's just a guess, but my guess is that they will be thinking that between now and something like May gives them enough time to pivot Albo's public persona so that he becomes more competitive, focus the attack on the government, and focus the economic message. Governments all around the world have struggled to deal with cost of living elections. So there'll be a keen eye on that. And, the fact that there is, something of an international mood exemplified by Trump, but also sweeping Europe, which is, anti-incumbent, making life is difficult for centre-left governments. And what are the ingredients of that? Well, the ingredients of that are discontent, economic stagnation, immigration debates. And sort of cultural wars, if we can make those factors minimised or absent in Australia, which I think is doable, then we don't have a ferocious immigration debate on our hands at the moment. We don't have a woke Labor Party that's out of control on various cultural issues. We do have an opposition that wants to have a cultural war, but they haven't yet found the traction to land it. So if that basket of sort of strategic questions can be answered satisfactorily, then we can go to the polls and hope to win, and that'll take us some time. So my money's still on May, but now you've got me thoroughly on the record. So if I'm wrong, there'll be plenty of proof.
One thing I want to go down a little bit of a rabbit burrow. I need to just get your thoughts on this. I had a conversation with someone else over the summer about it, and we got into an argument about the benefits and upsides and downsides to such a thing. But the Prime Minister was on Sunrise, and they were trying to corner him on getting a date out of him about when the election was, and he didn't want to get drawn on it. But he then sort of got a little bit not tangled up, but he himself went down a bit of a, I don't know whether he intended to start talking about this, but he sort of threw out some sentences around, we need fixed terms at a federal level. And that requires changing the constitution and getting bipartisan agreement. And the Liberals have never done that. Yada yada yada. Let's talk later about the Prime Minister going off script every now and then at a press conference and maybe trying to stay focused on what he should be talking about. But it did raise, and then Dutton obviously bites at that and says that here's the Prime Minister again once again wanting to have a really expensive referendum, yada yada yada, bringing back up the voice. Leaving that aside as well, what are your thoughts are on this idea? Because obviously at a state level, most of our state and territories now have fixed 4-year terms, and at the federal level, we don't. We have this scenario by which the election is called at the choosing of the Prime Minister or the government of the day, and also they are 3 years, but they move around, and sometimes they're not completely 3 years, sometimes they're more than 3 years. Does it make more sense for us to, even if we had this magic wand that we could wave and change the constitution, would you want to go to fixed 4-year terms?
Yes.
Why?
I think it makes for better government. I think the average now of federal governments is 2.4 years. But as you say, it's a 3-year term, but the government can call an election anytime in the third year, which obviously has led to lots of early elections over time. And I think, that old adage that a government's going to spend its political capital after an election doing things, but eventually its eye will turn to the next election rather than to the policy detail of here and now. And if we want governments to be more daring and to consume political capital doing difficult things that need to be done, then we have to give governments more time. So, yes, I think that would be a positive reform. And I think it has been at the state level, and it should be reflected in the federal level. And really the only reason that hasn't happened is, as you touched on, because it would require a referendum. And as you may have noticed, they're out of fashion this season.
Tell me when they were in fashion. They feel like 3-year terms feels like a Victorian pint glass. It's too small. 5-year terms, like they have in the United Kingdom, is like a pint glass, far too big, and your beer gets warm in summer. 4-year terms are like a schooner. It's just a perfect measurement. It's a perfect size for the length of a beer, and it's also the perfect length of a political term. What do you think about the idea of saying to all the states and territories, you all go on the last Saturday of November, which is the date that we have in Victoria, every 4 years, but it's that they all go on the same day, as in the same year, same calendar year. So every state and territory, for example, is like, say it's like November 2026. They all go on that same date. 2 years later, the federal government goes on that same date, last Saturday in September. So every 2 years, you're either voting in a federal election or you're voting in your local state elections.
Oh, I'm sure every state would embrace the idea of adopting Victoria's election date.
Not necessarily the date. Well, I say that date because
I
from
can
a campaign,
see that being a real winner.
South Australia and New South Wales go in March. And from a field organizer perspective, what annoys me is you'll lose the momentum of building your volunteer capacity because all of a sudden everyone pisses off to holidays over the Christmas break, whereas in the Victorian timeframe, you've got 1 full year to run at it. That's the reason why I like that November date. That's where I had an argument with someone else. But leaving aside, okay, I'll be flexible on the date, but the idea of all the states going simultaneously, it creates, I think it's good for voter registration, voter education to know that the last Saturday of November, every 2
I
years
think
of
if you
voting.
could wave a magic wand, I would agree. But it just strikes me as impossibly difficult.
Yeah, no. Anyway, there we go. Okay, you mentioned the poll, so I guess we started talking about what's been good news, and now I want to turn about what's been what I would say bad news. Polls aren't great. You've just touched on those just then, and you've also sort of started to talk a little bit there, David, about sort of how critical it is for the government to be on message for the final, I guess, 4 months of the election campaign. And I want to talk about, we touched on it a little bit in previous episodes, poor media performance. And I just want to get your sense of how we think the government, and in particular the Prime Minister, as our chief communicator, has been in recent weeks, and the importance of being on message. I just have sort of observed over the course of the summer, there was a couple of examples there where he did sort of press conferences where I just kind of was like, oh, can we just stay on message and not go down rabbit burrows? He got asked a question about the Victorian Labor Party had done a meme on their Instagram account that was getting stuck into Dutton, which was just rehashing that Courier Mail front page where Dutton's wife had said, "My husband is not a mobster," which, it's a bit of fun. But he then sort of went out on a limb and said he'll get them to take it down or something. Whereas normally I just think, like, that's a matter for the Victorian branch. On the Prime Minister, I've got time for that kind of stuff. My focus is actually on the people of Australia and addressing the cost of living and yada, yada, yada. Wandering off script with that sort of thought bubble about, 4-year terms, which opened up an attack from Dutton, as I said before. There's a couple other instances throughout the summer as well. And I just was like, Prime Minister, come on, let's just, like, we've got 4 months, let's get back on track. Am I being too harsh? Have you seen an improvement from the Prime Minister in respect to this? Please tell me you have.
Yeah, I think I have. And I think you are being a little bit too harsh. Um, I think one of the mistakes that the government makes is it's very easy to just fold in with the mainstream media and wander around performing for them and answering their questions, and perhaps losing sight of the fact that the mainstream media have never been less relevant in the lives of voting Australians. So the meme is a good example of this. Stupid meme comes out from Victorian Labor. Some journo in the gallery sees it, shows it to their friends. Oh my God, let's feign outrage and demand action. And suddenly the whole national political scene is convulsed with, faux outrage. And there's a 24-hour media cycle. Now, out there in Voterland, do you think they give a flying fidget about the meme? No. And what, politicians being nasty to each other? No. And, Steve Stakos, the Victorian State Secretary, is forced to come out and issue an apology. Like, give me a break. As I said to Steve, it's the job of a state secretary to eat shit sandwiches and say yum. And he got left with this one. But the whole thing was just a confected beat up by the mainstream media. And it was, no doubt, it was stupid and it was crass and it shouldn't have happened. But, with so many people wandering around with so many iPhones, some dumb things are going to keep happening. And it shouldn't dislocate the whole of the mainstream media and then all of the politicians who jump to its orders. So I think you've got to be beware of that. And, we've seen it's more advanced in other places, but, the media ecosystem has transformed. And there's a very interesting appetite for long form rather than gotcha moments and 8-second grabs. People there's certainly a significant audience that want to see more authenticity and get to know the values of the candidates better. And they're doing that not by watching Channel 9 or ABC or even ABC Radio. So, I guess the challenge is we're in a period of disruption and transformation, and we need to get that vibe, or else we're going to go under a bus. It's just depressingly easier for the opposition, isn't it? Because it's not like their absence of talent means they naturally focus everything on Dutton and a couple of others. And so that creates message discipline because no one cares what the others are saying. So that the market creates their message discipline. They didn't create it themselves. And then, to Dutton's credit, he has produced a Liberal opposition that has remained unified. Liberals notoriously like to fight when they're in opposition with each other, I mean. And that hasn't happened federally. I think in part because the Turnbull, Abbott, Morrison wars exhausted them, much like the Gillard-Rudd wars exhausted us, and they were done internal fighting for a period. But whatever the reason, he's led a unified opposition, and he just has to sit there and not accidentally blow himself up with a hand grenade to look like a credible alternative. He doesn't. The fact that he hasn't come up with a significant public policy proposition other than nuclear, the fact that he doesn't have a sophisticated media strategy doesn't matter because he stays in the picture. Whereas the government has the advantage of being in government and so theoretically having the initiative, but everything is more complex and the critics are more numerous.
I thought about, I watched Karate Kid over the summer, David. I don't know if have you seen Karate Kid?
Well, I saw it at an age-appropriate moment, Stephen. So it's probably,
when did you first see
1988 or something?
85. 85. I first saw it on the Fair Star.
And I haven't watched it again, to be honest with you.
Oh, no, you got to watch it again. Got to watch it again. Get the kids.
Yeah.
Friday night, popcorn.
Sure.
Shock top. But I was watching it and I was reminded of the scenes when Daniel LaRusso, the young student, Mr. Miyagi,
the sensei,
yes, was learning all the moves in karate. And the way he taught him was he made him sand his floors for a whole day, and he came back the next day and he had to paint the fence for a whole day, and he had to wax his cars for a whole day, and he had to paint the house for a whole day. And by the end of it, he's over it. He's like, all I'm doing is coming. You're supposed to teach me karate, and all I'm doing here is you are basically
slave labor.
Yeah, slave labor. And then he gets him to stand up and he says, show me sand the floors. And he does the motion of sand the floors. And Mr. Miyagi goes to throw a punch and he blocks it by sanding the floors. And he says, show me paint the fence. And he goes to do the motion to paint the fence and he throws a punch and he blocks it doing that same motion and wax on, wax off. And then
this story's going to
going somewhere, right?
Anyway.
He taught him these 4 defensive moves that he needed to deploy in karate. It was repetitive. It was hard, but it was trained into him to be disciplined and consistent. And I just feel like Anthony Albanese and all good politicians need a Mr. Miyagi media advisor to give them the 4 key frames that they only talk about from now until the election. They need to be focused. They need to be disciplined. And it needs to be at the heart of what is a meaningful benefit, as John Armitage would talk about, for voters. We had Steve Bracks on the show earlier in the month. And he was talking about, I said, what did you do differently, Steve, when you took over the leadership from John Brumby? And he said, I didn't talk about Jeff Kennett. I only talked about the things that I wanted to talk about that were our core. Well, he said, Stephen, I think you guys now call it a grid, but we didn't call it that. We had another name for it. He said, I felt like an idiot in so many press conferences.
The story. We called it the story.
The story, right, exactly. Whenever they wanted to draw me into some stupid stuff, I just said, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm only here to talk about these things. And I did it over and over and over and over. And otherwise you won't get cut through your core message. To the point you're saying, it's so fragmented, this media, that, not everyone's watching the ABC or Channel 9 or read the newspapers or on the radio. But as long as we keep on saying those core things we want to say, and I get a sense from the team that that's what they want to do. But for some reason, it's earlier in this stage, it's not happening. And I hope to God that we start to see a change in that. But you said, do you think you've started to see that from the Prime Minister? And that reassures me.
Yeah, well, yes. I think what I've seen is he's looking sharper, sounding sharper, doing more. I don't think we've yet got a storyteller, and so that ingredient is missing. I think Jim Chalmers, with his economic message, is telling a story. I think it would be good to see the Prime Minister doing the same. Again, you see, it's so easy for Dutton because he's got this long-time brand definition as the hard man, and he profits from the fact that people don't need to like their politicians, they just need to respect them. He kind of arrives at the contest as a plausible adversary in the public imagination. Mm. Albo's challenge really is, why have we seen his public standing decline in the way that it has? And I think, finding out the answer to that is obviously critical. But I think a big part of it was a loss of credibility and legitimacy after the Voice defeat, and a failure by the Labor government to pick up the pieces from that defeat and run hard on one or two or even perhaps three singular issues thereafter and show that it had a continuing purpose. And that's its challenge right now.
The other one I want to talk about and get your reflections on this is that obviously Dutton has got a strategy here where he's trying to bait the government, and in particular the Prime Minister, into being drawn into, you refer to as woke politics or identity politics or thing. And what I mean by that is like Australia Day, embracing Australia Day and enshrining it in our lifestyle as a sort of these acknowledgements of a country have just gone too far. Why do we need an Aboriginal flag? All that kind of stuff. He's just laying all of these traps. I just want to get your reflections on that. But before we do, let's play a clip. Probably one of the last media conferences that Bill Shorten did. He went on the Today Show on Channel 9 with Peter Dutton, and this is what he had to say.
One of the things I'm going to miss about you is how you predictably lose your mind just before Australia Day every year. Last year you were doing the one-man comedy show, Boycott of Woolies. Now you've gone to war with the sandal-wearing inner-city mayors. I don't know, next year you're going to make it a law that the big issue salespeople are going to wear an I Love Australia badge. The truth of the matter is that the only fight we should be having is the fight against cost of living, and the culture wars don't help reduce the price of goods or help people get into housing.
What I want to get your thoughts on Bill's response to it.
Well, it's sort of quintessential Bill, isn't it? It really reflects the remarks I made about him earlier, and that is he wanted to get the story back to Labor's strengths. He wanted to dismiss with humour the woke mind trap that Dutton and the Conservatives were laying. And so rather than, as is usually the case, Labor or the left defending some identity politics nonsense, he made sure that people understood the nonsense was actually on the right. And you're doing all these silly things, where losing your mind over Australia Day when you should just be normal like the rest of us. So he captured the middle, didn't he, in that interview? And he captured the centre and then swung about and talked about the things Labor regards as its strength. So, yeah, it was lovely.
The other thing I want to get a reflection on, just talking to some folks over the holiday break, is some of the strengths of Anthony Albanese as a politician who's had a long, illustrious career is that he loves Parliament and loves negotiating legislation with the crossbenchers. He loves the theatre of the chamber and the brawling of the opposition. He's very good at that. He also historically loves sticking his nose into factional disputes across the country. I'm just wondering though, and that's where we've seen him recently doing a lot of work. And I wonder is the Prime Minister's focus more on those kinds of things he loves doing and less on being the PM?
Well, he is quite truly a great legislator. Like, he is a great parliamentarian, and he has mastery of that chamber and that format, as you say. And it's human nature, isn't it, to like doing things you're good at. He's good at being a parliamentarian. On the factional stuff, I don't think he's inserted himself into factional politics any more so than some of his predecessors. Bill had a bit of an appetite for that, as I recall, and it wasn't helpful then, and it's not helpful now. But I mean, to be fair, leaders do have to. they can't divorce themselves from the parties they lead. They do have a stake in managing them, or in making sure the people they've entrusted to manage them are managing them. So I don't think we've seen any unconscionable conduct on that front. I know I've got some friends in the right wing of the Labor Party who will point out where I'm wrong about that, but fundamentally, I don't think there have been any grave atrocities. And I think party management is part of the job and does come with risks, and you do from time to time end up in a brawl, unhappy as that is. So, yeah, I think he showed, I think, in the last federal election campaign, where he performed superbly, that he can that he has developed, a strong public campaigning capability. Now, he gets, some people say that campaign showed that he was a terrible campaigner. He got COVID, you remember, during the campaign, and he got gotcha'd by not knowing the price of spaghetti at the local bistro or something. But absolute rubbish, as we argued at the time. Fundamentally, he won that campaign and won that election. So I think all of the ingredients for success are in front of the Labor Party right now. They just need to be assembled in the right way, and we need to understand that the job is just easier for the coalition and for Dutton. The times suit them in some respects. The economic landscape may suit them. And there are states where there are things particular to those states that might help propel the federal coalition. What's going on if you look at Newspoll, it's got Victoria now at 50-50 between coalition and Labor. That would represent a significant and dangerous swing to the coalition. Queensland remains locked at 53-47 for the coalition. So that's, continuing misery for Labor in Queensland. New South Wales is now 50-50 between the two, and that represents a swing and no growth for Labor in New South Wales. So, there's lots of problems that are regional and local in nature. So in these fraught times, Stephen, we certainly need the leader to perform, but we've got every reason to think he very well will.
Victoria, you did mention Victoria, and the polling in Victoria, as it is across a couple of states on the eastern seaboard, isn't great. And I'm just interested in getting a sense about the government's strategy to support those campaigns. Like, we have a project like the Suburban Rail Loop that's more popular than Taylor Swift, and by media reports, the state government's obviously looking for additional funding in that regard to support the funding that they've already put into it, and we've not seen much come from them. And the Suburban Rail Loop runs through 8 marginal seats.
Yeah, I think the Victorian challenge for Labor is that the travails are basically all around state issues, aren't they? And it's the standing of the Jacinta Allen's government. And I've certainly noticed that over the last, I'd say 6 months, there's been a continuous stream of economic criticism of the Allen government. And it seems clear to me that whereas Daniel Andrews and the Labor government at that time was given, I guess, a leave pass on economic issues because of COVID and the impact of COVID, the budget was in deficit, but of course it was. There'd been a 2-year lockdown. With Jacinta Allen, that leave pass has suddenly been withdrawn. And so she's being held accountable for a debt that her government didn't accumulate, and we were all there when it happened. And everybody supported the Victorian government taking measures to support small business, but now suddenly there's outrage about how much it cost. Anyway, so that the Victorian government has got an acute problem with its economic story, and that's a topic for another moment. But that's done great damage, I think, across Victoria. And I guess we'll find out at the Werribee by-election coming up. And that reflects on federal Labor, and federal Labor is living with this ghost, I suppose. In 1990, when the Kane government was in the depths of unpopularity and Bob Hawke called an election, Labor lost 9 seats in Victoria and it almost took out the federal government. So, while people distinguish between state and federal elections, plenty do hold the brand responsible and pay out on it when they feel like they should and could. So that is a spectre that hangs over the federal election, that concern about Victorian Labor and the economic performance of the state is going to be another nail in the coffin of federal Labor.
So by that rationale, then surely you would want to invest in a state where you have a lot of MPs and support them and support good projects or policies that are very popular.
Sure, but you can't pump prime the economy in Victoria so that it's different. There are some issues that's a fight Victorian Labor has to win. That's not if Albo puts federal Labor in as a surrogate for that and makes the argument, then they're just putting themselves right in the bullseye, aren't they? Maybe they can help arm Victorian Labor to win that argument, but they can't be a proxy for Jacinta Allen and win that argument for her.
I don't completely agree with the view that the reason why that we're polling badly in Victoria at a federal level is because of Jacinta Allen.
Oh, well, there are all those other factors we've described,
Yeah.
but that makes it more acute. Take South Australia, for example. Their federal Labor is 53-47. Our numbers are fabulous. Well, the renaissance of a Labor Premier, Malinauskas, is obviously a factor there too. Like, these things do matter. Like, they don't account for all of it, of course.
No, I'm not completely dismissing it, but I just think it's lazy for federal caucus members to be saying, "Oh, we're struggling in Victoria," and it's all down to.
It's not all down.
Yeah.
No, but it's a factor for sure.
Yeah. But I'd think that then I get a sense that from other state caucuses, they're very good at going in and actually fighting for their state when it comes to the allocation of federal resources. How united, you can't comment on the current caucus of Victorian MPs that go to Canberra, but I just never got a sense that, when you were a federal MP from Victoria, how united were you guys in terms of going in and lobbying for, financial support for the things that you want to do in your home state compared to other states?
Well, Victorians don't lobby governments, mate, because Victorians form and run governments. And then small states come and ask us for stuff. That's how it works.
But you see the point I'm making, though.
I see the point you're making. For most, a Victorian-led Labor for most of the time I was in Parliament. Whether it was Julia Gillard or Bill Shorten, it's a different dynamic.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's. I'm conscious of the time. I do want to wrap it up. I do appreciate this conversation, though, and I do want to just stress to the listeners out there. I know we've sort of talked about some of the strengths of what's going on in terms of getting ready for this election, but also some of the weaknesses. But there obviously are incredibly talented people like Paul Erickson, who's the National Secretary, Jen Light, his assistant, National Secretary. They're doing great work. And even in the Prime Minister's office, and I pick out a couple of names only because I know these people. I'm not singling out these people in particular and then ignoring other names, but like Sam Trobe, Katie Connolly, these are some of the smartest political minds in the country. I'd like to think that, people are leaning on these people and trusting their abilities. This can be turned around. The polling's not great right now. People are nervous, but it can be turned around. And all campaigns have strengths and weaknesses, and it's our job to play to our strengths and highlight the weaknesses of our opponents, which we'll talk more about in the coming months, no doubt, David.
We are blessed to have a National Secretary who's capable and who's got one win under his belt already. So has experience. That's a critical ingredient for success, and we haven't always had that ingredient.
No. Let's call it a day, David. I wanted to talk about international affairs. I've got some great names for that segment, but I'm going to share them with you next month. Thank you so much for your time this week.
You don't want me to give another 35-minute soliloquy on affairs in Syria?
Hey, to be honest with you, I got good feedback for that. People were like, that's remarkable. He didn't even take a breath. Never came up for air.
Yeah. It was pretty funny.
So until next month, David, thank you for your contribution today.
A pleasure.
Look forward to talking to you in a month's time.
Fight the good fight.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. Like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.